While other kids asked for video games or football boots on their birthdays, I longed for a disposable camera. The magic of developing photos felt like pure wizardry to me. My passion for photography persisted throughout secondary school, much to my parents' frustration, as I showed little interest in academics. I understand their stress over my poor performance. I simply didn't enjoy being nagged by teachers every day. I knew what I wanted to do with my life. After leaving school at 16, I pursued my dream. I interned with a professional photographer for a year, gaining invaluable experience before I began freelancing for anyone willing to pay. Building a solid portfolio took a few years, but once I had it, along with the necessary experience, I felt ready to apply for serious jobs. The photography job market can be quite peculiar, and without going into too much detail, I found it often either excessively seedy or dreadfully dull. However, one opportunity caught my attention. Overseas photographer for the Times, one of the most prestigious newspapers in British history. I applied and had an interview that made me feel shaky, convincing me I had blown my chances. To my surprise, someone saw potential in me and called with good news just days later. This job took me around the world, and it was an incredible experience. Occasionally, I found myself in more dangerous situations. I visited Afghanistan in 2011, Iraq in 2012, and then in January 2014, I was offered a chance to go to Syria. For context, the Syrian civil war began in mid-2012, after a year of intense protests and violent government crackdowns. By 2013, the situation escalated, with various armed rebel groups receiving foreign support and confronting government forces. However, 2014 marked a pivotal shift, as the landscape changed from mostly secular pro-democracy rebels under the Free Syrian Army to the emergence of Islamist and jihadist groups, some linked to Al-Qaeda. Our mission was to drive into Aleppo, connect with our contact in the Free Syrian Army, and establish any relationship, if it existed, between the FSA and the jihadists. We flew to Turkey at the end of February, spent a few days near the Syrian border, and crossed over in early March. The atmosphere was starkly different from Iraq and Afghanistan, where the fighting had calmed. Syria, in contrast, was a live conflict, a war in full swing. We didn't arrive on a military aircraft or cross the border after passport checks. We entered Syria without permission, with no safety net, and uncertain of what lay ahead. That realization felt profoundly different. After driving into eastern Aleppo, we met our rebel contact in Jabal Badro. The journalist I was with, Ben, had previously worked with Omar during a trip to Aleppo in 2012, making their reunion quite emotional. Ben had gained Omar's trust by delivering cartons of cigarettes and basic medicines, a strategy he continued during my visit in 2014. It seems that handing out paracetamol and cigarettes can make you popular in a war zone. The week spent with Omar's unit was both positive and productive. I picked up some Arabic, connected with the rebels, and captured at least half a dozen photographs that I considered among my best work. That first week was primarily about acclimatization, both to the intense heat and the mental challenges ahead. We planned to spend our second week with another group of rebels who, unlike Omar's faction, had strong ties to a jihadist group known as the NF. For clarity, I'll refer to them as the NF. They had actual connections to Al-Qaeda. Their leader had been in Iraq for several years before entering Syria in 2011 to exploit the chaos of the civil war. Once he gained power, he wasn't about to let it slip away. The NF's leader was indeed mad, but he wasn't stupid. He understood that kidnapping journalists and executing them would create a terrible reputation. If they wanted to keep receiving weapons from the US and EU meant for larger, less intimidating rebel groups, they needed to behave. Knowing we weren't actively hunted was probably the only reason we felt even slightly safe traveling near NF-controlled areas. Still, we had no intention of engaging with the group or its fighters. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Navigating the city was challenging, especially for those unfamiliar with it. Imagine that nearly all your reference points, street signs, landmarks, and businesses are destroyed. Even locals who knew Aleppo well struggled to find their way. I'm not talking about just a few bullet holes. Entire streets had been leveled by airstrikes. Our drivers noted that the thin layer of dust covering everything made the winding streets of eastern Aleppo look identical. I'm sure you can see where this is going, but I'm a photographer, not a writer, so I'll skip the structuring and get to the point. On our way to meet this other, less intimidating group of rebels, we took a wrong turn. We didn't realize our mistake until the people we thought were sent to meet us suddenly aimed their guns and ordered us to kneel. We were completely confused about what was happening and who they were. Initially, we thought it was the other group being overly cautious about security, as everyone was terrified of spies. Later, we learned that we hadn't been rudely welcomed by paranoid allies. We had been captured by a different faction with strong ties to both the NF and another jihadist group that hadn't yet gained notoriety. Once we realized we were prisoners, our driver, captured with us, immediately began negotiating for our release. We assumed they wanted money and were promised a substantial amount. However, according to their leader, Abu Khalid, they would make much more by selling us to a wealthier militant group operating out of Raqqa. When we asked what would happen to us there, Abu Khalid said he neither knew nor cared. His only concern was the large sums of cash the Raqqa group was offering for British or American prisoners. It was a grim realization that we were likely to be held hostage for a long time. Both Ben and I trusted our governments and employers to work on securing our release, as well as that of our driver, Athman. We believed it was only a matter of time before we were freed, as at that stage of the war, securing funding from outside the country was crucial. It made little sense for any armed group to kill us. We actually thought we were more at risk from government loyalists than from any rebel group, jihadists included. There was simply too much money to be made from ransoming 2 British journalists. Even though this group was willing to pay our captor $40,000 for both of us, it was an investment that could yield millions. It must sound a bit crazy to some. I know it sounds crazy to write this all these years later, but being a prisoner wasn't as bad as it might seem. The group that captured us primarily wanted to make money, and they loathed the government loyalists far more than they could ever hate us. After a few days, our guards began to warm up to us. They had to feed us and keep us safe because another jihadist group insisted they wanted us alive and unharmed. After a while, they removed our restraints, invited us upstairs from the basement where we were held, and essentially let us hang out. They warned Athman, our driver, if your lot try to run, we'll kill you, but otherwise, we were told to behave. We managed basic conversations in our broken Arabic, but for anything serious, we relied on Athman as our translator. The group holding us weren't frontline fighters. Their job was simply to guard us. Surprisingly, they were decent guys caught up in the chaos of the Civil War. We talked about various topics, and they were incredibly curious about our lives back in London. I'm serious when I say they must have asked us 1,000 questions over those 9 days. They wanted to know what London was like, what kinds of food we ate, and what our living situations were like. Abu, the most senior guard, was particularly interested in which football teams we supported. Ben wasn't into football much. He preferred rugby. But for me, photography was my passion, followed closely by football. I've always loved my local team, Queen's Park Rangers. I know I'll get some ribbing from fellow fans, but QPR isn't a big team, and I figured Abu only followed the top leagues, so I didn't expect him to know them. When I told him I was a QPR fan, his face lit up. He launched into an enthusiastic speech to Athman, who translated. I caught a few words and heard him mention QPR repeatedly, so I knew he was talking about the club. Athman then told me, Abu says he's a great admirer of your Moroccan attacking midfielder, Adel Tarabt. My jaw dropped. Athman continued, Abu says Tarabt's 19 goals and 16 assists during QPR's 2011 season were a huge achievement for a player his age, and he absolutely deserved the Championship's Player of the Season award. Abu was spot on. As a diehard QPR fan, I loved Tarabt and cheered for every one of those 19 goals. I asked Abu through Athman if he remembered Tarabt's goal on Boxing Day of 2010. Abu jumped up with a big smile and started mimicking the exact movements of what became known as the Christmas cracker. He reenacted Tarabt's cheeky backheel to trick one player, then tapped the ball through another player's legs before acting out the incredible shot that even the goalkeeper couldn't stop. I was in raptures, or perhaps I should say, too rapturous. I asked if Abu remembered Tarabt running over and hugging some random QPR fans in celebration of his goal. That kind of connection was why he was so popular. He loved us, and we loved him, and we weren't afraid to show it. Abu did remember the hug, and just like that, we launched into what turned into a 2-hour conversation about football, with everyone gathering around for the entertainment. It was surreal. Here I was, discussing football with the man who had taken me hostage. That moment marked a high point during our captivity, because, for a brief time, it felt like we weren't prisoners anymore. It was as if we were among friends. Although I didn't realize it then, I believe that conversation about Tarabt ultimately saved our lives. We spent another 2 days in Abu's compound, which were probably the best days we had there. We were given generous portions of food when invited to eat with the other rebels, and afterwards, they shared cigarettes and sweets with us. Following dinner, they had countless more questions about our lives back in London. However, after about an hour of chatting, Abu asked if he could speak with me privately. By private, he meant just him, me, and Athman. We walked to a quiet corner, and through Athman, I asked if there was any news on the hostage transfer. I made it clear that I wasn't making demands. I was just anxious to know when and where we would be transported. Abu looked at Athman, then back at me. After a sigh and a moment of thought, he began to relay his reply through Athman. As I watched him speak, I noticed the color drain from Athman's face. He turned to me and said, "Abu is hesitant to sell us to the group in Raqqa." At first, I thought it was because he felt cheated, and the idea of selling us for a low price while they profited immensely left a bad taste in his mouth. But that wasn't his main concern. He could accept selling us to someone who would eventually release us, but that wasn't the intention of this other group. They went by several names at the time: the Mujahideen Shura Council, the Army of the Victorious, and the Congregation of Monotheism and Jihad. However, the name they would be known by in the coming months would live in infamy: ISIS. The group that wanted to buy us was just months away from officially renaming themselves the Islamic State. The reason they wanted us alive was chilling. They planned to decapitate us, film it, and turn our executions into sleek propaganda videos to post online. By the time Athman finished conveying this, I understood everything except their impending name change. I must have looked as pale as he did. I begged Abu not to sell us to those people, promising that we could guarantee them tens of thousands of pounds if they ransomed us instead. They told us it was too late. ISIS was already on their way to collect us. They would arrive at the swap location a few miles outside of Aleppo within 48 hours, and if we weren't there for the exchange, there would be trouble. By then, Athman had taken over the discussion. After a few more minutes, he conveyed the essence of what had been said. Abu would escort us back to our contact, Omar, and tell his bosses and the ISIS members that we had escaped during an attack by government soldiers. He had two conditions. The first was that we had to leave Aleppo immediately. If his bosses found out he had let us go, he would be a dead man. That was non-negotiable. The second condition was that I give him the little QPR supporters club card I kept in my wallet so he would have something to remember me by. I handed it over without hesitation. Just a few hours later, we were on the move again, heading back toward Omar's group, with whom we had spent our first couple of days. 48 hours later, around the time we should have been handed over to our ISIS executioners, we were waiting at the airport for our flight transfer, and soon after that, we were on our way home. Ben ended up writing the story he had been assigned, using many of my pictures. However, he made no mention of the kidnapping in his article, and the photos I took of us with our captors have never been published. I wanted Ben to thank Abu in his story, but we knew that would jeopardize Abu's safety. After a prolonged and intense battle, the Syrian army retake full control of Aleppo in December 2016. Syrian state media announced that they had secured the city after an evacuation deal for the remaining rebel fighters and civilians was reached, giving a slim chance that Abu managed to escape alive. I know he technically wasn't on the right side of the conflict, but if you understood the situation, you wouldn't be able to call any group involved the good guys without feeling uneasy. I don't know what else he did during the war, but Abu saved our lives, and for that, I'll be forever grateful. I often wonder if he's still alive and if he ever made it out of Syria. So if you happen to hear this, Abu, and you're anywhere near Loftus Road, reach out so we can go to a game together and talk about football and peace instead of war. In April 2016, my friend Tony and I were headed to a birthday party in Baton Rouge. It was our mutual friend's 23rd birthday, and her parents had let her host the celebration at their house in Santa Maria. I was really excited, especially since Santa Maria boasts some beautiful homes, perfect for a party. However, neither of us knew the neighborhood well. I was driving while Tony, in the passenger seat, was trying to navigate and also serve as the DJ with our pre-party playlist. While he was great at picking up beat songs, he wasn't the best navigator. Santa Maria is divided into 4 sections, with a golf course in between. We eventually found the right area, but the real challenge was locating the correct street. A text from a friend mentioned a number on Manchac, so we were searching for something like Manchac Road or Manchac Avenue. After mistakenly turning onto Manchac Lake Drive, we encountered several other streets: Manchac Way, Manchac Trace, and Manchac Crossing, each with similar names, leaving us confused. I asked Tony to call one of our friends to confirm the address, but when we reached someone, the loud music made it impossible to hear. She promised to check with our friend for the correct address and call us back, but she never did. We drove up and down Manchac, trying to determine if the party was at the number on Manchac Way or one of the other streets. We looked for clues: cars parked outside, groups socializing on porches, or the distant thumping of bass. It would have helped if the party were inside, but the arrangement was to keep it in the backyard and pool area to avoid damaging the house. This meant both houses looked nearly identical, with dark exteriors with no signs of activity and a lineup of cars outside. Eventually, we decided to try one of the driveways, thinking the worst that could happen was a confused homeowner pointing us to the right place. I drove up, stopped the car, and we sat in silence for a moment. I felt a strong instinct that this wasn't the right address, The house was dark, with drawn curtains, but then I noticed a flicker of movement inside. Someone was home, but if this was the party, they seemed to be hiding. I told Tony I didn't think we were at the right place, but he insisted on knocking on the door. I hesitated, unsure it was wise. His last words were, "What's the worst that could happen?" Just then, my windshield shattered. Glass rained down as gunshots rang out, and I saw flashes from an upstairs window. My heart raced as I realized we were under fire. Time slowed as I felt each bullet hit the car. Panic surged in me, and a voice in my head shouted, "Put the car in reverse, or you're both dead." With adrenaline pumping, I fumbled for the gear stick and threw the car into reverse. The tires squealed as I slammed on the gas, jolting us backward. I heard Tony yell something, but I couldn't focus. I was too busy watching the rearview mirror for any obstacles. We shifted back into drive and sped off into the night, air rushing in where the windshield had been. Relief and fear flooded over me as we escaped the danger, still buzzing from the adrenaline. I nearly shouted, "Oh my God, we made it!" When I realized Tony had been shot, I pushed the car's engine to its limits, speeding wildly as the world outside blurred into a mix of streetlights and shadows. I glanced at Tony and saw how pale he looked, the pain etched on his face, and a wave of fear hit me at the thought of losing him. I yelled at him to hold on, assuring him we were headed to the hospital and would be there in just a few minutes. All I had to do was keep my foot on the gas, stay on the interstate, and take the exit for Baton Rouge General. I had no idea how many times Tony had been shot, and I suspected I might have been hit too, but I couldn't focus on that. I needed to keep my eyes on the road as I wove in and out of traffic. That was the hardest part for me, the fear that if I passed out at those speeds, we would both die. I thought I felt blood in my stomach and legs because it was warm and wet, but looking down would mean disaster. I remember nearly crashing into another car while swerving onto the exit ramp, and then almost crashing again as I skidded into the hospital parking lot. I stopped right outside the doors, jumped out, and ran to Tony's side, calling for help. When I opened his door, I felt hopeful because we had made it so quickly, but panic washed over me when I saw his face. He was pale, struggling to breathe, with blood everywhere, and his eyes were glazed over, as if he were minutes from death. I kept yelling at him to stay with me, shaking his shoulder and telling him help was on the way. Just then, paramedics rushed over to get him out of the car and into the hospital. As they wheeled him away on a gurney, I mentioned that I thought I'd been shot too. That warm, wet feeling I had, it wasn't blood, it was urine. In the chaos, I had actually peed my pants, and I struggled with the shame of that for a while before coming to terms with it. I once met a Marine who served in Afghanistan, and he told me that during shootouts, some of his squad mates would need to pee. He described how one Marine would roll onto his side and just urinate right there, preferring that to soaking his underwear. He said none of them considered him a coward. I met this guy in a therapy session about 6 months later, and when I shared my experience, he laughed. At first, I was offended, but he explained he was laughing at the idea that I saw myself as a coward. He thought I was one of the bravest people he'd ever met, impressed that I acted quickly and managed to drive to the hospital without crashing. I thanked him, feeling a sense of relief, but when I got back to my car, I broke down and cried ugly tears, not just a single tear like in a movie. It meant everything to me, and for the first time in that waiting room, I didn't feel like a total failure. As for the waiting room, it felt like another dimension. Time crawled, the place was packed, and I felt completely alone, trapped between wanting news about Tony and dreading what that news might be. It was hellish, and I mean that in the truest sense. If there's hell, it probably feels like that waiting room in Baton Rouge minus the flames. My mind kept replaying what had happened in that driveway, and checking my phone became a ritual to break up my thoughts while keeping our friends updated. I looked up every time the nurse walked in, thinking this would be the moment, only for them to call someone else or walk right past me. Sometimes, it felt like I was trapped in a bad dream, a nightmare filled with antiseptic smells and blinding lights that stung my eyes. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally entered the waiting room and called my name. He led me to a quiet area and delivered the news. When he told me Tony was alive and that they were optimistic about his recovery, I felt a relief like never before. I had to put my head in my hands, fighting back tears. After gathering myself, I listened as the doctor explained that although a bullet had entered Tony's chest, it had missed his heart and major arteries. However, it had collapsed a lung, which was why he struggled to breathe when we arrived. To fix this, the doctor performed a procedure that involved inserting a tube into Tony's chest, reinflating the lung so it could function properly. The bullet also broke a rib, which would be painful but would heal over time. Most importantly, Tony was stabilized and had been moved to the intensive care unit, where his pain would be managed and he could be monitored. He wasn't completely out of the woods yet, but considering how young and healthy he was, the prognosis looked good. I had the option to go home and rest or stay at the hospital and see him in a couple of hours. Covered in glass and blood, I opted to return after a shower and change of clothes. At home, I spoke with several friends who had been at the party, and we agreed I would pick up a few of them on my way back. After nearly an hour of waiting, we were finally allowed in. 2 groups entered to see him, 1 group of 2 and another of 3. I went in with our friend Cherry, and walking down the corridor to his ICU room felt like the longest walk of our lives. As we approached the door, I braced myself for what I would see. I knew Tony was likely going to be okay, but it was still daunting. When I entered his room, I was overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. I was relieved to see him alive, but he looked just as vulnerable as when I first brought him in. What struck me most was how happy Tony was to see us. He was weak and couldn't move, but he had just enough energy after surgery to talk to us briefly before the nurses came in and told us he needed rest. Before we left, Tony and I shared a moment. He told me I had saved his life, but I insisted he was mistaken. He had saved mine. If I had driven to the party alone, I was certain the shooter would have aimed for me instead. Since Tony hadn't opened his door yet, the lights in my car hadn't switched on. Instead, he had his phone at full brightness, held at chest height, which likely made him an easy target from the shooter's perspective. The guy was a terrible shot and only managed to hit us once directly, but I have no doubt he used the light of Tony's phone as a reference point for his aim. If Tony hadn't been there, I would have taken the shooter's lucky shot, and I definitely would have passed out on the way to the hospital if I wasn't killed instantly. In many ways, he took the bullet meant for me. Tony spent just over a week in the hospital, and oddly enough, that was the same day the man who shot him pleaded no contest to attempted manslaughter. The charges were reduced from murder because, in the past year, this guy's house had been targeted in 2 separate home invasions. One group ended up in prison, and one of those inmates warned our shooter that his friends were coming for him. So when we pulled into his driveway in a car he didn't recognize, he opened fire without giving us a chance to identify ourselves. His attorney claimed he was so scared that he didn't want to take any chances. Despite it being his first conviction, the judge labeled him a danger to others and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. I would have preferred a longer sentence, but there was a time when we thought he might get no jail time at all, so knowing he received at least some time was a huge relief. Tony has since made a full recovery and somehow found it in his heart to forgive the man who shot him. I suppose that's the kind of grace I should expect from him, but for me, it's much harder to simply forgive and forget, not after coming so close to death together. For our 2nd anniversary, my boyfriend and I planned a weekend getaway at a luxury log cabin. We had been visiting the same coffee shop for a few months when I accidentally spilled his iced latte all over him. Definitely a clumsy moment. Rob was so understanding about it. The next time we met, I offered to pay for his dry cleaning, but he suggested it would be better if I took him out to dinner instead. Since there was undeniable chemistry between us, I happily agreed. Now, 2.5 years later, we're flying to Nashville to spend a few days with Rob's parents before heading to the hills of Monroe County near the North Carolina state line. Initially, I was against the idea. Rob and his family are outdoors enthusiasts, and I feared his cabin might be a cramped hunting shack with meals of raw deer meat for 3 nights. Rob reassured me that wasn't the case. When I remained skeptical, he showed me the cabin's website. It looked incredible, perched on a hillside with a large deck offering a stunning view. There was a fire pit and a hot tub for soaking under the stars, and that was just outside. Inside featured an open floor plan with high-vaulted ceilings and exposed wooden beams, along with leather sofas and state-of-the-art appliances. The kitchen had a charming farmhouse sink and a cozy breakfast nook. What truly captivated me was the old stone fireplace. I could easily picture Rob and me curling up together in front of it after a long hike. Plus, the bathroom had heated floors, which I had never experienced in a hotel, let alone a cabin in the woods. After seeing the website, I went from skeptical to excited. We spent 4 wonderful days with Rob's incredibly sweet parents. On Friday morning, we loaded up our rental car and hit the road toward Coker Creek. Everything was going smoothly, and we even stopped in Chattanooga for food since we were ahead of schedule. But once we passed Coker Creek and turned onto the back roads to find our cabin, our progress slowed dramatically. This was back in the late 2000s, and while we had an early model GPS in the rental, it was about as useful as a glass hammer in those forested hills. We had a sheet of printed directions and a paper map, but we realized the directions were useless when we hit our first dead end with no luxury cabin in sight. Long story short, we retraced our path about 4 times, but each time we ventured deeper into the woods, we got disoriented and ended up going in circles before finally finding our way back to the highway. Frustrated, we tried again until we drove down a road that led to a house instead of another dead end. It was Rob's idea to stop and ask for directions. The house looked very old, so we figured anyone inside had lived in the area long enough to know about the cabin we were looking for. It was a small, single-story home with faded, peeling paint that might have once been white, revealing patches of rotting wood. Missing shingles caused the roof to sag in places, and patches of moss covered large areas. As we approached the porch, we could see it was barely holding together. There were gaps in the floorboards, and the banisters were splintering. When Rob stepped onto the first step, it creaked loudly, almost like a doorbell. The moment the porch creaked, we heard movement inside. All the windows were either shuttered or covered with cloth and newspaper, but we knew someone was home. Rob knocked on the door, expecting someone to answer quickly since we were sure someone was just inside. However, it wasn't until Rob politely asked if they could give us directions that we got a response. The door opened just a crack, revealing a woman of around 50. She was short, had a thick accent, and didn't seem pleased to see us. When she asked what we wanted, Rob explained we were looking for directions. The woman said she couldn't help. Her husband was out running errands and knew the area much better than she did. We could either get back in the rental car and try the maze of back roads again, or we could sit on the porch and wait, hoping her husband would return before dark. She kindly said she didn't mind us waiting and apologized for not being able to help. We thanked her and took a seat on an old porch swing after dusting it off. We waited close to an hour, passing the time by reminiscing about our 2 years together. It was our way of staying positive. Worrying or complaining seemed pointless since we were sure we would eventually find the cabin. At one point, I made a comment about how we had been sitting on this lady's porch for almost an hour without an invitation inside. So much for Southern hospitality, I joked. Rob stepped off the porch, glanced at the house, and said, "I guess they must really value their privacy." He motioned for me to look at something. All 4 downstairs windows and all 5 upstairs windows were covered with grim-looking curtains, canvas sheets, or newspapers. As I observed this, the house began to creep me out. I knew exactly what Rob would say if I voiced my thoughts, that these were just simple folks who valued their solitude. It was a far cry from Manhattan, but they were good people who would likely help us if it meant reclaiming their privacy. So I kept quiet. I knew he was thinking at least a bit of what I was thinking. He had to be. Our options were to wait for directions from the lady's husband or risk getting lost in the woods again, without being able to return for help. After less than an hour of pacing and grabbing snacks from the car, we heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Sitting on the old couple's porch swing, the sound lifted our spirits immensely. If anyone knew where our luxury cabin was, it would be this pickup driven by an old-timer who had likely lived here long before our cabin was built. We waited until we saw the truck coming up the trail. Then Rob said, "I better go make myself known. He's going to wonder whose car that is," referring to our rental. We stepped off the porch and waved at the oncoming truck as Rob jogged toward it, pointing to our car as if to say, "That's ours, and we come in peace." The truck stopped just short of the rental as Rob approached. An older man opened the door and stepped out while Rob began talking to him. He was wearing a denim shirt, a canvas jacket, jeans, boots, and a cap with some kind of logo. He seemed to listen intently to Rob. Suddenly, I was startled by the lady's voice coming from my right. "My husband's home," she said, a wide, unsettling smile stretching across her face. I looked at her for a moment, wondering, what are you up to? I turned to look at Rob and saw him suddenly back away from the lady's husband. He raised his arms and started shouting, "No, no, no!" Then the man aimed a pistol and shot him. I had no time to react because, right as Rob fell, I heard a screech coming from my right. The lady had burst from her front door with a hatchet in her hand, rushing down the porch toward me. I ran the opposite way, jumping off the porch and darting around the corner of the house. The whole time, I was thinking about the guy with the gun and how I needed to put solid objects between us to avoid being shot. His wife was really no threat to me at all, and these days I get a kind of wry smile whenever I think about her, tripping as she followed me off the porch and crashing into the dirt with a pathetic grunt. But it took me a long time to be able to think of it that way. I knew the guy would be coming for me. He had just shot my boyfriend of 2 years right in front of me, so there was no way he intended to let me get away. The thought of what he would have in store for me if he caught me made me feel like I could have sprinted for days. My sister was something of a true crime aficionado, completely hooked on A&E and investigation discovery. Whenever I stopped by her place for a few glasses of wine after work, she would inevitably regale me with tales from the latest true crime show she had been watching. I won't go into too many gory details, but one thing that really creeped me out was when my sister told me something to the effect of, "They kill the guy you're with right away, so they can take their time with you." That thought kept running through my mind as I sprinted through the trees, away from the house, away from the rental car, and away from Rob. I ran and I ran and I ran some more. I ran until my lungs hurt, until I could feel my pulse thumping in my head, until my thighs ached from the mindless, terrifying exertion of running for my very life. I ran further than I needed to, imagining some ex-Marine sniper being able to pick me off through the trees at distances I assumed were safe. I ran until I felt like I was about to pass out. And then when I stopped, I puked up all the water and snacks that Rob and I had eaten, our final meal together, and we hadn't even known it. I think I must have run for about a mile before I came to a road. After following that for a while, I saw a fire lookout, which turned out to be empty. I must have wandered through the hills and woods for at least 4 or 5 hours before I came across any signs of civilization. It's strange to think about it now. I was so exhausted, and the situation was so surreal, that I must have seemed unusually calm to the people whose doorstep I ended up on. I remember asking them politely if I could please use their phone because my husband had just been shot. They thought I was talking about some kind of hunting accident, but when I told them it had been murder, they were naturally very alarmed. They asked where it happened, and if the shooter was headed this way, but I told them I had been walking for miles and had no idea how to get back to the house by road. I think if I had known Rob might still be alive, I would have been much more frantic in my pursuit. Maybe I would have wanted to go back, holding out hope that he could still be saved. But I had no hope. I saw where he had been shot. I saw the way he fell. That man wanted him dead. Rob most probably flatlined by the time I stopped to puke. So instead, I called the cops and waited in those nice folks' homes until they arrived. They asked me to show them where the house was on a map, and I said that I only knew the rough area, but I showed them as best I could. They searched for days, but the house was nothing but a smoldering ruin when they finally located it, and Rob's body was nowhere to be found. His parents kept him on the missing persons register for a few years, hoping that if someone found his remains, it would make the identification process easier. About 18 months ago, Rob's mom and dad completed the process of having him declared legally dead. We held out some degree of hope for a while, but at some point we had to face the facts. Rob was never coming home. He was gone, and he was gone forever. We held an official funeral for him the following month, and since I can't think of any other way to finish this, I'll just end with the eulogy that I read at his funeral. Rob was more than just a partner. He was my best friend, the person I could turn to for light when days seemed dark. He lived with a spirit that embraced every moment and found beauty and meaning in small things. His kindness and generosity touched everyone he met, and his love made my life richer than I ever thought possible. Though our time together was cut far too short, I am grateful beyond words to have loved him and been loved by him. He's not just with us in memory, he's in every laugh, every act of kindness, and every adventure that we take in his honor. So thank you, Rob, for every precious moment. I will carry you with me always. Did you enjoy this content? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Support us with a like and subscribe so our channel can reach more people. Thanks for watching until the end.